Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next of our Monday Spotlight sessions, where we're going to be talking to a fantastic volunteer manager about a role that she's very proud of and has been making some great progress in her organisation. So really pleased that Sally Dyson has been able to join us today. Sally is Volunteer Services Manager at Norfolk and Norwich University Hospitals. And she's also Vice Chair of NAVSM, which is the National Association for Volunteer Services Managers. So she's very much steeped in volunteer management, and we really welcome your experience today, Sally. So Sally's volunteering team has recently started to run a special volunteer service. It's called Welfare and Safety Netting calls, where volunteers support people as they are discharged from hospital and return home. And this is really high priority, as we all know at the moment. So, Sally, I wonder if we can start with where the role came from, because we know that you've been heavily involved with supporting patients post-discharge. How did the safety netting service start?
Okay, so for those of you who know me and know the projects we run at the Norfolk and Norwich, we've been running for some time now a community-based settle-in service. These are volunteers that help people to settle into their home on their day of discharge. So they meet the patient at home, they check their lighting, their heating, unpack their bags, do a little bit of washing, make beds, cup of tea, that kind of thing. They carry out an environmental risk assessment for falls and evidence of incapacity on that patient, and then they feed back to a coordinator for signposting to ongoing VCSE support. Now, that project was always followed up by a follow-up call. So what we used to do the very next day after we'd settled the patient in at home, we'd do a follow-up call to check on the welfare of the patient. And what we discovered was there was an awful lot of learning from that. The majority of patients that the volunteers settled in were classed as non-complex patients, or D2A0 pathway patients, and in theory needed no support at home. But what we discovered when we were doing the follow-up calls, that actually this wasn't necessarily the case, that a lot of these patients were going home and they did have additional needs once they got home that we were just not aware of, or they hadn't told us about before they left hospital, and so we knew there was a need there to pick issues up. So in September 2021, there was a new national discharge policy. I don't know how many people on the call will have been aware of that, but the national recommendation was that all hospitals should be providing a follow-up call for all patients post-discharge. Now, for us, we're a 1,300 acute trust. It's a massive hospital. That's £1,000 patients a week being discharged, which is a lot of people. So we're aware that the hospital wasn't in any way would have the capacity to pick up that kind of safety netting call to patients. Now, what we did discover is that the pathway 2s to 4s were covered, because they had recognised packages of care and ongoing clinical intervention. So basically, most of those patients were followed up in some sort of way post-discharge. But the pathway 0s, those non-complex patients again, those people that were recognised as needing no recognised package of care, they were the people that weren't going to be receiving the calls. So from the settle-in experience, we knew that, this was not necessarily the case. They're not necessarily going home without needs. So we thought we could actually expand on our learning, and we offered to take on those D2A0 pathway patients. We were aware that was quite a big ask, and part of that was to apply for some funding, and it sort of fell in place with the NHSEI funding. We managed to get 1 year's worth of funding, 25,000, to develop the service. The funding bid was successful, and we appointed a coordinator to start the project back in April 2022.
And yeah, so what would a typical shift look like for a volunteer, Sally? What do they actually do when they log on for their shift? What kind of things could they expect to be doing?
Okay, so they're initially required to attend an awareness session, which sort of fully outlines the remit and scope of the project and why we're doing it, what the benefit is to the hospital, to the patients. And then they receive some one-to-one training with the project coordinator, and they learn a strict script. So that's sort of put in place to start with. Once we've done that, they have a sort of observational competency session, where the project coordinator will sign them off once they're sort of independently making calls with confidence. So they then come in on a daily basis and they receive a list of patients from our information services. All patients are discharged the previous day, and they make calls to those patients from that list, asking a series of questions to ensure that the patient is safe to remain at home and with the correct support. So to give you an example, some of the questions we ask are things like, you know, how was your first night back at home? Have you had a meal? Are you eating and drinking okay? Can you make a meal independently, or do you need help? Do you have difficulties with washing, dressing, etc.? How about food shopping? Are you able to manage, or does somebody else need to do that for you? Are you able to carry out tasks such as housework and laundry, utility bills, that kind of thing? Do you feel you've got enough support to remain at home? Because a lot of people, it's just a confidence thing, and sometimes that that really comes through on these safety netting calls. And we also ask a little bit about how well informed they felt about the discharge and whether they felt the correct measures were put in place before they were discharged, so we can sort of feed back to the hospital about how patients perceive the information they've received at point of discharge.
And what difference can volunteers make at that point? So if somebody says, I'm really worried, I don't feel at all confident, I'm scared I'm going to fall, I might end up back in hospital, what can volunteers do at that point that could really help that person?
So this was the reason why we needed the coordinator. For anyone that's sort of listening and thinking, oh my God, I haven't got the funding, I don't think you need a coordinator forever, but you certainly need a coordinator to set it up initially, to set up those mechanisms for that feedback. So what happens at the moment is the volunteers are trying to identify and escalate issues or concerns on the project, and they feed back to the project coordinator immediately. So for the majority of calls that are absolutely fine and lovely, they just record the lovely feedback, but for any with concerns, they go immediately to the project coordinator. So they've got a dedicated phone line to the coordinator. The coordinator is able to then contact the patient, and they will confirm the details of the call that they've had with the volunteer. Consent is received from a patient to enable them to enable the project coordinator to then sort of carry out any actions accordingly. So depending on what the concern is, the project coordinator is able to contact clinical colleagues for advice, for instance, and provide lots of sort of in-house problem solving around medications, discharge letters, OT equipment, lost property, anything that they've really raised, that most of it can be solved in-house. But they can also signpost to VCSE organisations for ongoing community support. So for instance, for shopping, meal provision, equipment, benefit advice, companionship, anything that's been raised, we do have a signposting option. And then we've also got, since we developed the project, we've managed to arrange for a fast track phone line to all the GP surgeries. So everybody that's having problems contacting their GPs at the moment because they're 75th in the queue or whatever, we've got a dedicated line through to the GP. So if we've got a patient that's recently been discharged, they've got concerns, we can actually signpost directly into that surgery. We've made 1,000 calls. This week was our 1,000th call. So we've made 1,000 calls to date since April. And the majority of them are really positive. That's the lovely thing about it. It is really positive. And so from impact on the hospital perspective, it's lovely to be able to feed back that really positive feedback to our staff. Morale's quite low right now, and this really makes a difference to be able to feed back that lovely positive feedback to people. But for the people that do have problems, we do know it has been incredibly impactful and has definitely prevented readmission, 100%. Regular issues are things like patients going home without their TTOs, patients going home without their discharge letters haven't been sent to the GPs, catheters not working, missing tubes, connectors, bags, communication between staff and the discharge process, confusion with new medications. They're regular things that come up all the time that over a period of time, the coordinator has learned how to deal with quite efficiently. So it's really making a really big difference.
That's amazing. So you mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned there that that it was lovely to be able to feed back to staff, you know, the difference that the volunteers were making. So what kind of stories have you had from the front line, if you like, about the difference it's made to patients?
So from the perspective of patients, so the volunteers are sort of feeding back little quotes from the patients. So we're collecting obviously data from the project. And one of the things they're doing is sort of collecting what patients say to us, and you know, it's things like, you know, oh, how lovely that, you know, I've got this call, you know, I'm gone but I'm not forgotten, you know, I've been discharged but the hospital still cares about me, and oh, you know, what a wonderful service, you're the only person I've spoken to today, you know, it's so nice to have somebody to talk to, and I feel quite vulnerable having just been discharged from hospital. Just confidence, you know, thank you for calling me. I just feel so much confident about things now. What a relief to receive your call. You know, I was so anxious about my missing medication, and now you've relieved that anxiety. Things like, you know, signposting that people don't necessarily always realise they need. So we had one lady that said, oh, thank you so much for signposting me to Red Cross. I hadn't even considered how I was going to eat or get my shopping. That was the last thing on my mind, you know, but actually when she got home, she suddenly just thought, I've got no food in the house and I've got nowhere to get food. And no relations. So it's things like that are really sort of lovely feedback that patients, when they're in a state of confusion on discharge, really don't necessarily think about all their ongoing needs. And so when we ring them once they're home and they've suddenly realised that they've landed at home without something fairly vital, this call has really sort of been quite impactful to them.
That's fantastic. And you mentioned actually slightly earlier about the links that you've been able to make with community organisations, which is so important now, and people are really waking up to the possibilities, but also the need for making those connections. So have you got some examples of connections that you've made through this role with community organisations?
So yeah, we have. I mean, bearing in mind, Sally, our settle-in service has been running since 2013, so we already had lots of links with our VCSEs. It's something we've done. You know, I have a dedicated community-based coordinator who actually does, you know, manages those relationships with our VCSEs. So it's something we've done for a long time. But for instance, for this particular project, the local ICB have actually picked it up, and they've been really interested to sort of learn from it and to enable similar services to be established in our other two regional Q trusts. So they've picked it up and they're now making links with VCSEs that we're working with. So it's almost sort of part of that whole integrated package. That people are looking at it as a wider care package post-discharge. So it's been really good learning for everybody, I think. Our integrated discharge team have recognised the benefits of utilising volunteers to carry out the calls. They're sort of saying, you know, I think the volunteers are getting more clear information than perhaps a medical professional would, because they're probably less likely to criticise things if it's a medical professional, where with a volunteer, they're a little bit more open. They're happy to sort of say what went wrong, what's not quite so right, and what could have been better. Our patient experience team are picking up on it, because obviously we're getting all the lovely compliments, and they're making sure that they're going to the staff. And so yeah, I think, you know, the links for VCSEs has always been there, but it's improved through the project. And what we're finding is that a lot of those referrals that are made out, we're learning new things about the VCSEs, about what they can actually do, because they're sort of expanding their services by picking up what our needs are. So for instance, we're working with Voluntary Norfolk at the moment, and we just called them and said, look, you know, we've got gaps, we've got VCSEs that can provide certain things, but we've got areas that we can't provide. Can you provide it, or do you have a service that can provide it? And they've sort of, you know, developed a service around it almost. So it's been really good for everybody. I think it's really sort of brought everybody on board.
Yeah, it's fantastic to hear of those examples of something that starts small and grows arms and legs, and suddenly it's as you say, it's a really integrated package of support for people. And it's been great to hear about the impact on patients and staff. What do the volunteers love about the role? What do they tell you about their experience?
So they just all love the fact that it's making such a big difference. They can really see the difference. We have a regular little, well, about every 2 months, bi-monthly meeting. We have a little coffee morning. We bring them all together. We put some PowerPoint slides up and say, this is how many calls you've made. These are the issues that you've uncovered. This is what was done about them. This is the learning from it. This is who's picked it up. This is where it's going, you know. And for them to see that from their basic call, it's gone as high as our board and our clinical improvement teams, I think is really impactful for them. They really feel that they're making a massive difference. And I think they just love the fact that they're able to sort of feed back some really positive stuff to the staff. They know morale is low in the hospital, as it is in all NHS trusts right now. You know, to be able to sort of provide these lovely compliments as a morale boost for staff, they're really chuffed to be able to do that. And they make sure if anyone says anything really, really positive, that they get a name so they can feed it back to the person involved, you know. And yeah, I think, you know, it's just a lovely, lovely project. And I think they really feel it's a really worthwhile thing to do.
Sally, thank you so much. It's been really great, and we've packed a lot into this 15 minutes. It's given people a lot of information. So it may be that people have got questions that they'd like to pick up, and we can field those questions and forward them to you if that's okay, if people want to find out more about that. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for joining us as well. Our next Monday Spotlight will be on the 20th of Feb, and we're going to be talking to Eleanor Morris from Royal Wolverhampton about the clinical volunteer role. So really hope you'll be able to join us then. But for now, thank you again, Sally, and have a good day, everyone. Take care and see you soon.